Hey there and welcome back to another Fruits Basket review. And finally, after weeks and weeks of depression, we had an uplifting episode that made you feel good inside and hopeful for the characters again. With Kyo and Toru's storyline getting a firm conclusion, as well as the true origins of the Zodiac curse explained in more detail than ever before. Now, just before we get started, I will say I have read the manga and I'm aware of any relevant future plot points or details. Plus, the finale's already been released, so I'm already aware of how the end pans out. However, for the purpose of these reviews, I only really like to talk about what the anime is presenting up to this episode and not jump back and forth between manga and anime. This is mostly so I can keep the reviews streamlined and allows anime only fans to watch along and join in too. That being said though, let's get started on the episode. We start up again with little room between the episodes, picking up pretty much straight where the last one left off, with Toru noticing that Kyo's come to see her as she comes out of the hospital. And instead of facing him and confronting her fears of rejection, she sprints off, leaving not just Kyo in the dust, but also Uetani and Hanajima, the two people who'd come to see her and help her get home. And to be honest, it was really funny straight out of the gate, and I can't say I blame her. Because in all honesty, Kyo pulled a selfish and smooth-brained move the last time he saw her. Yeah, he was upset and hurting, but it seemed like he was far harsher than he needed to be. On top of that, not visiting her throughout the whole time she was at the hospital was also pretty rough. We then see him sprint and catch up to her and ask her to wait, only for her to sprint off in the other direction again whilst a mother and daughter walking by discuss how he clearly got dumped. And that got a nice chuckle from me. I wasn't expecting these random extras to suddenly throw shade at Kyo quite loudly. And considering we've been hit with a whole bunch of seriousness throughout several episodes, it's nice to start off with some lighthearted humour. Kyo then muses to himself that her rejection kind of hurts, but I find it hard to feel sympathy. Like I said before, he kind of deserves this. Plus, we all know that's going to turn out fine for him in the end. So yeah, hard to sympathise. Meanwhile, we get a brief look at Toru's inner monologue as she discusses how she knows running away is in the right course of action, and that it wasn't what she'd planned to do when she saw him again. That she'd intended to grit her teeth and smile, even though she'd been rejected. We then have a sad little flashback in the hospital where Yuki tries to talk to her about Kyo, and she starts crying before slapping her face to make herself stop, whilst Yuki has a mental breakdown worrying about her head trauma. She then talks about how she'd practiced over and over that she'd smile when she saw him, that she wouldn't hurt him and all the other people around her with her sadness about her rejection. It's kind of like she's trying to revert to how she behaved for her mum, putting on a brave face so as to keep others happy. But obviously, that's not what happened, and she actually feels guilty about it, which is also quite tragic considering literally none of this is her fault. Kyo then finally catches up to her, and here we get hit with the more serious element of the episode. Another love confession. Except this time, it'll actually go according to plan. We see Kyo at a distance approaching Toru as she cries and begs him to stay back just for a moment so she can stop crying. So that he won't feel as bad about what's happened, and he won't be even more disappointed in her. And man, it really sucks that he said that, because it was clearly one of her biggest fears to let somebody down she cares about. It's almost unforgivably selfish for him to have said something like that. Of course it all turns out fine in the end, but it's still sad to think about. He keeps walking, regardless of her wishes, and she just keeps crying, which is once again, fair enough. Taking hold of her hand, he admits how selfish he'd acted in trampling all over her feelings and unleashing all his pent-up guilt and frustration on her before running off to avoid the consequences of further guilt. He apologises to her for how he acted and for making her cry, recognising that he was just repeating history and not letting himself move forward, and that life doesn't always give you a chance to say sorry. He then finally tells her that he loves her and that he wants to keep on living with her and not let his curse define his life anymore. After she asks whether this means they'll stay by each other's side holding hands, he replies that they already are, and they kiss while she muses this is like a dream. And honestly, it being a dream would be a funny twist, if she woke up in the hospital and this had all been a dream brought on by the head injury. A dark twist though. Anyway, it was nice and very satisfying to finally get this happy moment that had literally been years in the making. I'm glad they didn't drag it out and decide to put it early in the episode instead, because it really would have slowed the pace and made it less enjoyable as a whole. And I think they'd built up enough suspense as it is. After they break apart, we get a nice little moment of levity where Kyo jokes that this was actually their second kiss, although she probably doesn't remember it, which shocks and embarrasses her. Haha, remember that time I made out with you while you were unconscious and bleeding from the head after falling off a cliff? Classic Kyo. He then shyly asks whether he can hold her, even if it's only for a moment because he'll transform into the cat again. He then sort of apologises for his body and the curse, but Toru tells him that it doesn't matter because she loves him no matter what, and that her love is invincible. And it's kind of like an echo of what his mother used to say, except it comes more from a place of love and acceptance rather than love and fear. And I guess this makes all the difference to Kyo, who then proclaims that he must be invincible too. And it's crazy how his personality shifted since he's been able to let go of his anger and realise that he isn't a monster. That somebody in the world loves him and wants him for him. And it's sad to think that he's had to repress himself like that until now, even if he did it unconsciously. He then pulls her into a hug, and to the surprise of no one, he does not transform. And then we flash to Akito, who's standing alone, bidding her final farewell to Kyo's bond to her. And side note, I know that he'd accepted the curse and decided to live his life with it, but was he seriously prepared to transform in the middle of public, right then and there? Sure, there were no people around, but there are some pretty tall buildings in the immediate vicinity. Are you telling me those are all vacant, or no one can see or look out the windows? I mean, we know that Kyo doesn't always think things through, but come on. We then flash back to Toru's time in the hospital and get to see Akito's conversation with her and how it all went down. Akito explains to Toru that the reason behind her anger and hostility was her jealousy. She was jealous that this person that she perceived to be kinder and prettier than her had come into her private space and stolen away the love of those that were supposed to love her best. Stolen the love of those that were supposed to be bound to her forever. And because she could feel those Zodiac bonds weakening and slipping away, she resented Toru more than anybody else. Toru then asks her not to try and divide them by calling her pure and pretty because Akito embodies those qualities as well, like when she cried out in anguish at being lonely. She goes on to tell her it's understandable that she resented her because Toru was trying to destroy the future she'd been promised, and then asks her whether she'd still consider being friends with her. Akito then replies that she's very persistent, and while at first it may sound like this is a dismissal, it more feels like she's embarrassed that somebody's being so kind to her and giving her this kind of attention without her ordering them to. Overall, it's kind of a dulled down rehash of what happened in the previous episode, but I think it reassures Akito that Toru wasn't just saying things to make her feel better while being threatened with a knife. That she actually meant what she said. We then return to Akito in the present, where she has just farewelled Kyo from the Zodiac bond, and she wonders whether there'll be time for new meetings and beginnings after all is said and done. And to me, this shows how far she's come as a character, as she's pretty much placing her faith in Toru at this moment, realizing that the bond has to end and Toru can help her move forward. We then get to see the true version of the Zodiac story. That there was a lonely god living on the peak of a mountain, and despite many people living in close proximity to them, none would visit, and thus they felt alone. They realized that they were different from the others, that they could never truly be one of them, much like Akito feels in the present day. Afraid of being judged by others and rejected. We see that the first friend that the god makes is the cat, who paid a visit to the summit. The cat begged to be allowed to stay by God's side, never left them for a moment, and over time their bond allowed God to come up with the idea of inviting others who were unlike humans to the mountain. And thus, the Zodiac animals arrived and began their tradition of sharing banquets together. Eventually, the cat became sick and it was clear it was going to die, and the animals lamented, fearing that soon that they would all die too and the banquets would end. Refusing to accept this, God enchanted a cup of sake and gave the cat a sip, crafting an eternal bond so that even after death they'd all be connected and they would reincarnate to share the banquets together again and be friends for eternity. However, the cat then begins to cry, telling God that he neither needed nor desired to have these eternal bonds, causing the animals and God to become angry at the rejection of the gift. With the cat then stating it wants God to be able to accept humanity and walk amongst them instead of hiding behind the Zodiac bonds. So this is pretty much why the cat's ignored as a Zodiac and has a cursed true form, because of this perceived betrayal, and thus it's punished and not accepted because it rejected the bonds. As for why it's locked up though, I'd actually argue it makes more sense that God locks it up because it was the first friend it made, and God wants to always keep them close, but doesn't trust them to stay after they rejected the bonds. Or at least that's how I'd interpret all that. It also makes it sadder that the cat was mistreated for so long, because all they ever wanted was for them to be happy. It makes it especially sad with how they were judged for turning into a monster when they were the truly selfless original Zodiac wanting to be with God before any of the others. And with this new info we have now, it would have been really interesting to see more of Kyo and Akito. She kept Yuki close for so long because the rat was closest to God, but it would have been cool to see the toxic relationship between the god and the cat. Surely the god would feel scared of losing the cat most of all. And it would have played well into Akito and Toru's conflict too, because Toru loves the cat the most as well. But then again, I guess with how the story was told today, even the present Zodiacs weren't aware of the true nature of the story and the true relationships between the god and the animals. Then we see Akito collapse, asking her father whether she's able to let go now and be her own person. Whether it's okay for her to stop being special and no longer be a god, just a human, even though she's alone and feels frightened by what's to come and the prospect that without the bonds keeping them to her, none of the Zodiacs will love or care about her anymore. And then she finally says goodbye, all while intercut with Kyo realizing that the curse is finally broken and that he's free. And then it cuts to Ayame, who has also realized that his curse is broken. And instead of just breaking down like a lot of the others do, the first thing he does is call out to Mine and confess that he was born to be with her. And man, I love the romance between all the main couples, but I will admit this got me, in a way I wasn't expecting. It was just a very serious and yet sweet moment from a character that's predominantly used for comic relief. And then we get a sweet montage of the remaining Zodiac members realizing that the curse is broken and that they're free to live normal lives at last. Of note to me though is that it didn't look like Haru cried at all, which was interesting. I guess that ox mentality will linger with him forever, either spaced out or angry. No room for anything else. We also get to see Shigeru's reaction to finally succeeding while sporting some brand new scars as well. And when he says, "So this is what it feels like," it's almost wistful. As though he wasn't expecting to feel mournful and kind of has some regrets about losing that feeling of connection to everybody else. Before the montage concludes with Kyo finally being able to destroy his bracelet without turning into a monster and hearing God's voice saying farewell. Also, Toru's face here was so raw with emotion, it was honestly great. Chef's kiss. Mwah. And then we get to truly conclude with some post-credits scenes. We hear the voice of God asking when the promise of eternity became an unbearable curse as we see Kyo and Toru show Kazuma that he's no longer cursed. And, of course, the show's #1 dad gives his son a big old hug, and it's pretty heartwarming to see Kyo finally get some proper father-son love and be able to properly accept it. We also get to see Toru reunite with Rin and Haru before they abruptly leave to head to the main estate with Hatori. Meanwhile, the god narrates about how the beginning of the bond was full of love and friendship, but as time went on, those who inherited the spirits became different and the bond became twisted and negative. He tells the spirits that even after the bond became a curse, they all carried it with them no matter what, and thus he's still happy, even if it has to end. We then see Toru, Kyo and Hatori visit Akito, who drags Toru inside to hug and hold her, and this is cute. Akito now understands that she can't go and visit the Zodiacs straight away to give them their own time to deal with the curse breaking, but at the same time has no one to comfort her. She's probably been sitting in there for ages worried that nobody was going to come, and that Toru would not actually be her friend. But then she turns up and vindicates Akito's choice to break the curse, and it's very sweet. Especially that Toru immediately thought about how lonely Akito would be feeling and wanted to comfort her. And then that brings us to the end. And initially I was mixed on this, because on my first watch I felt like the retelling of the Zodiac story was kind of boring, long and pointless, and I wanted to see the reaction to the curse breaking. On subsequent watches though, it definitely holds its own as an episode and is actually quite moving, especially the Zodiac story. I'm happy to admit, I was wrong there. Plus, having Kyo and Toru finally have a resolution to their relationship was long overdue, and it really made the front half of the episode feel really special and exciting. But that's just my opinion, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the episode? Like it? Hate it? Make sure to leave a comment and let me know.